David, known for his wisdom and leadership, showed a devastating flaw when it came to his only daughter, Tamar. She suffered a brutal assault, and instead of acting, David chose silence. The Bible teaches us that this silence was not just an omission, but an act that allowed injustice to take root and devastate the family even more. Tamar needed justice, and by ignoring her pain, David left his daughter helpless. Tamar's pain was evident, but David chose not to confront the situation. His silence echoed like a cry of indifference, leaving Tamar isolated and Absalom consumed by revolt. The Bible reveals that although David was a respected king, his inaction in the face of the aggression against Tamar meant that he failed in his most important role, that of protective father. David's silence began to create cracks in the fabric of his own family. Absalom, seeing his sister's suffering, felt the weight of David's inaction. Revolt welled up in his heart, and he decided that if no one would do justice for Tamar, he would do it himself. The Bible describes that while Tamar lamented her pain in silence, Absalom nurtured a feeling of revenge that grew with each passing day. In his passivity, David didn't realize that his silence was building a future tragedy. Tamar, who trusted in her father's protection, found herself without anyone to take action on her behalf. The Bible points out that David's omission was like a second aggression for her, a symbol of the failure of her entire family. Tamar's pain was not just because of the violence she had suffered, but because of the lack of response from those she most expected to support her. This silence enveloped her in unbearable loneliness. While David remained focused on the affairs of the kingdom, his home became a place of suffering and disunity. Absalom, increasingly estranged from his father, began to plan in secret. He knew he couldn't count on David to act, and this only increased his anger. The Bible makes it clear that David's silence not only destroyed Tamar's hope, but also fueled Absalom's thirst for revenge. The absence of justice not only affected Tamar, but also the whole family. David's silence showed weakness, and that weakness turned into resentment. The Bible shows us that instead of using his position to restore peace and justice, David chose not to act, allowing the consequences of his inaction to become more and more serious. The weight of his silence was unbearable. Absalom took Tamar in, but that didn't erase his pain. She lived in her brother's house, but without the emotional support she expected from her father. The Bible tells us that Tamar, although protected by Absalom, carried a deep sadness that consumed her. Absalom, seeing his sister without hope, increasingly felt the desire to take the law into his own hands. David, however, remained silent. Days turned into weeks, and David's silence remained. Tamar continued to suffer, and Absalom continued to plan. The Bible reveals that with each day that passed without justice, Abbas's rebellion grew. David's destructive silence was like an open wound, which only got worse as time went by. Tamar lived a broken life, while Absalom nurtured his revenge. David didn't realize that by not acting, he was destroying his family from the inside out. Tamar needed an answer. She needed her father to show that he cared. The Bible shows us that by choosing silence, David not only failed Tamar but also pushed Absalom down a path of darkness. The powerful king, who was supposed to protect, chose omission, and it came at a high price. David's silence was about to trigger something much bigger. Tamar, without justice, and Absalom, full of rage, were the harbingers of a storm to come. The Bible prepares us for the consequences of such a profound omission. What began as an act of violence was now turning into an imminent tragedy, about to shake David's entire family. David had an extended family, made up of several wives and many children. This arrangement, common at the time, created an environment prone to rivalry. Each wife wanted her children to be favored, and this fostered internal disputes. The Bible shows us how this dynamic of favoritism and jealousy made the family environment increasingly unstable. Tamar grew up in the midst of these silent tensions. David's sons competed not only for their father's attention, but also for power and recognition within the family. Tamar, although loved by all, was the only daughter and therefore had a different role. She was regarded in a special way by David, but this affection was not enough to protect her from the family traps. The Bible tells us that while David concentrated on the affairs of the kingdom, his home became an emotional battleground. Amnon, one of David's eldest sons, began to harbor a dangerous obsession with Tamar. He watched her with increasing intensity, and this obsession grew worse in silence. The atmosphere of rivalry and ambition meant that each of the sons sought something for himself without concern for the others. The Bible makes it clear that the danger signs were there, but no one paid enough attention. While David was busy keeping order in the kingdom, his family was slowly fragmenting. Tensions between the sons were ignored, and rivalry grew by the day. Tamar, without knowing it, was at the center of a game that involved power, desire, and envy. The Bible shows that in the midst of this troubled situation, the signs of an impending tragedy were becoming increasingly clear. Jonadab, Amnon's cousin, noticed his obsession with Tamar and, instead of trying to stop him, decided to encourage him. He saw the fragility of the family as an opportunity to manipulate situations in his favor. The Bible shows us that, instead of helping Amnon to dispel his wrong feelings, Jonadab fed his intentions, preparing the ground for something terrible. David, in his position as king, seemed oblivious to what was going on between his sons. The Bible recounts how he believed that his role as leader of Israel would be enough to keep the peace at home. But what he didn't realize was that his silence about the internal conflicts only increased the distance between him and his sons. Tamar, in the midst of this, was increasingly vulnerable. Each of David's wives had their own interests and hoped to see their children in prominent positions. This constant competition not only increased the rivalry between the brothers, but also left Tamar in a delicate position. The Bible illustrates how, while mothers encouraged their sons to seek better positions, Tamar just wanted to live in peace. But in this environment, that was practically impossible. The fragility of the family context was evident, and the signs that something serious was about to happen were ignored. David believed that everything was under control, but the seeds of destruction were being sown. Amnon, with his growing obsession, and Jonadab, with his manipulation, were setting the stage for tragedy. The Bible warns us that ignorance of family tensions often comes at a high price. Tamar, without knowing it, was increasingly surrounded by dangers within her own home. She trusted her brothers and believed she was safe among them, but the reality was very different. The Bible describes how Tamar's trust would become her greatest vulnerability, while Jonadab and Amnon plotted in secret. David, far away, had no idea what was about to happen. David's family environment was like a powder keg, about to explode. The rivalries, ambitions, and forbidden desires were all there, just waiting for a moment of carelessness to manifest themselves. The Bible prepares us for what was to follow, a tragedy that was not just the result of an isolated act, but the sum of ignored tensions and devastating silence. The tensions within David's family were not just momentary. Over the years, jealousy and rivalry became part of the routine. The lack of leadership allowed tensions to build up. The Bible describes how, as the children grew up, the signs of jealousy and competitiveness were constant. But David chose to ignore them, believing that the problems would resolve themselves. Amnon, overcome by an unhealthy obsession with Tamar, began to act strangely. He showed his interest in increasingly obvious ways, but the family didn't seem to realize how dangerous this could be. The Bible shows us how this obsession was not just a passing feeling, but something that grew inside him and would soon turn into a tragic action. Jonadab, Amnon's cousin, saw the situation and decided to take advantage of it. Instead of advising his cousin to control his desires, he encouraged his obsession. The Bible reveals that Jonadab suggested ways for Amnon to get closer to Tamar, which ended up feeding Amnon's inappropriate desire even more. This advice was the spark that set the stage for what was to come. Meanwhile, David was oblivious to what was going on in his home. His absence as a present father allowed jealousy, desire, and manipulation to take hold without barriers. The Bible tells us that by ignoring the danger signs, David failed to realize that his family was about to fall apart. Tamar, without knowing it, became increasingly vulnerable to this intrigue. Amnon, increasingly consumed by his obsession, decided that he needed to do something to be close to Tamar. Jonadab's advice encouraged him, and he began to prepare a trap. The Bible shows how Adam's desire became an uncontrollable force, and the signs that something terrible was about to happen were obvious. But no one around realized the seriousness of the situation. David's absence as a father figure was becoming increasingly evident. Not only did he not notice the growing tension, but he wasn't there to stop his sons from going down dangerous paths. Jonadab, with his manipulative suggestions, and Amnon, with his burning desire, were building a situation that could not end well. The Bible shows us that David's omission created the perfect space for chaos to ensue. Tamar, innocent, knew nothing about what was going on in the shadows. She trusted in the love of her family and believed that her brothers were there to protect her. The Bible describes how Tamar, without knowing it, was being led straight into a trap. Jonadab manipulated Amnon, and Amnon, blinded by desire, could see nothing but his obsession with Tamar. The signs were ignored by everyone. David, Jonadab, and even the servants who saw Amnon's behavior did nothing to stop the course of events. The Bible warns us about the dangers of ignoring the signs that something is wrong. With each passing day, the tension built up, and the atmosphere became more and more conducive to tragedy. Amnon, encouraged by Jonadab's words, finally decided it was time to act. He pretended to be ill and asked Tamar to come and look after him. The Bible tells us that Tamar, without suspicion, complied with her brother's request, while Jonadab and Amnon set the scene for what would be one of the most tragic moments in the history of David's family. The situation in David's house was about to explode. Rivalry, desire, lack of guidance, and ignored signs had created an environment where tragedy was inevitable. The Bible prepares us for what was to follow, an act of violence that would mark Tamar's life forever and bring devastating consequences for David's entire family. Amnon, fueled by his obsession and encouraged by Jonadab, finally put his plan into action. Pretending to be ill, he asked Tamar to come to him to prepare a meal. Tamar, innocent, suspected nothing and complied with her brother's request. The Bible describes how Tamar's trust led her straight into a trap, where her own brother was waiting to betray her in a brutal way. As soon as Tamar entered Amnon's room, he revealed his true intentions. Tamar, taken aback, tried to resist, begging him not to do it, trying to convince him to think about the consequences. The Bible recounts how, even in the face of Tamar's desperate pleas, Amnon didn't back down. He forced her, destroying not only her innocence but also her dignity. After the act, Amnon turned on Tamar with contempt. He ordered her out of his presence, expelling her in a cruel way. The Bible describes how Tamar, in despair, tore her clothes and put ashes on her head, a symbol of her pain and shame. She ran out screaming but found only closed doors and averted eyes. The violence she had suffered was not only physical but also a deep family betrayal. When David heard about it, he was furious but did nothing to punish Amnon. The Bible shows us that David's silence once again left Tamar helpless and without justice. This omission was devastating for Tamar and generated a growing rebellion in Absalom. Tamar needed a father to defend her, but David's silence was yet another aggression, this time emotional. Absalom welcomed Tamar into his home, offering her the refuge that David was unable to provide. However, Tamar's pain would not go away, and her life was now marked by constant mourning. The Bible tells us that Tamar became a lonely woman, living as a shadow of her former self. Absalom, seeing his sister's pain and his father's lack of action, began to harbor an ever deeper desire for revenge. Amnon's attitude not only hurt Tamar, but also broke up the family unit once and for all. By refusing to take action against his abusive son, David lost Absalom's respect and made it clear to everyone that his position as a father was flawed. The Bible shows us that by not punishing Amnon, David allowed injustice to reign, and this inaction sealed the fate of his family. Tamar, now living under Absalom's protection, carried with her the shame and pain of the abuse she had suffered. She was not only a victim of violence, but also of a society that chose to ignore her pain. The Bible describes her sadness as a wound that would never heal, and the lack of justice only deepened her suffering. David's lack of action meant that Tamar would never have her value restored. Absalom silently began to plot his revenge. He knew he couldn't count on David to deliver justice, so he decided he would take matters into his own hands. The Bible tells us that Absalom kept his intentions hidden, waiting for the right moment to act. Tamar, meanwhile, remained in mourning, living a life without hope of redress. The act of violence against Tamar was not just a crime, but a breaking point in David's family. David's silence, Amnon's violence, and Absalom's revolt formed a chain of events that could not be undone. The Bible prepares us for what was to come, a cycle of revenge and pain born out of a lack of justice and compassion within the family itself. The tragedy that struck Tamar was only the beginning. Absalom, motivated by his sister's pain and David's inaction, was determined to seek revenge. The Bible takes us to the next events, which promise to be even darker and more devastating, as Absalom begins to act in the name of the justice that Tamar never received. David was furious when he discovered what Amnon had done to Tamar, but despite his anger, he took no concrete action to punish his son. This silence was deafening for the whole family. The Bible shows us that this lack of action not only left Tamar helpless, but also destroyed the trust Absalom had in his father. David failed in his role as father and king, and his inaction had devastating consequences. Tamar, already weakened by the brutal attack she had suffered, saw her pain completely ignored. She needed justice, a firm response from her father, but what she received was silence. The Bible describes how this silence was even more painful for Tamar than the violence itself, because it meant that her suffering would not be acknowledged or repaired. Tamar found herself both physically and emotionally helpless. Absalom, seeing his sister suffer without any support, began to plan his own justice. David's silence was not just an omission, but tacit permission for Amnon to continue unpunished. The Bible tells how, faced with this injustice, Absalom decided that he would take action himself. While David remained inert, Absalom grew emotionally distant and nurtured a growing hatred. For Absalom, David's lack of action was an unforgivable betrayal. Tamar had not received the justice she deserved, and this led Absalom to harbor a sense of revenge. The Bible reveals that he acted coldly, hiding his intention until the right moment to act against Amnon. It was David's silence that awakened in Absalom the certainty that he would have to be the executor of justice. Tamar, living in Absalom's house, was in a state of deep mourning. She had not only lost her innocence, but also the hope of finding solace in her family. The Bible describes how Tamar lived a life of isolation, marked by shame and abandonment. Absalom, seeing his sister's suffering, decided that he would never let what Amnon had done go unpunished. David, although furious, chose the path of omission, and it cost him dearly. The king's authority within his own household was weakened, and his sons realized that he wasn't acting as circumstances demanded. The Bible shows us that David's silence became a loophole that Abbas took advantage of to plot his revenge. His father's passivity was the catalyst for an even darker future. Amnon, on the other hand, faced no consequences for what he had done. He believed he was safe, protected by his father's inaction. The Bible reveals that this blind trust would be what led to his downfall. While he continued his life as normal, Absalom waited for the right moment to act and bring justice for Tamar, who continued to suffer in silence. Tamar, with no hope of justice, became a constant reminder of David's failure. The Bible describes how Tamar's pain was ignored by everyone except Absalom. This pain, now transformed into a desire for revenge, was the fuel that drove Absalom. Not only did he want justice, but he also wanted to show David that his inaction would have a very high cost. David's silence was not just a personal omission, but a failure as a leader and protector of his family. The Bible warns us about the dangers of failing to act in the face of injustice, and David was about to learn this lesson the hard way. Absalom, ever more distant, was waiting for the right moment to act and break ties with his father once and for all. The story was about to take an even more tragic turn. David's silence, Tamar's pain, and Absalom's rebellion were intertwined to form an inevitable storm. The Bible prepares us for what was to follow: revenge that would shake David's entire family and have profound consequences for everyone involved. The story of David's only daughter, Tamar, leads us to reflect on the consequences of silence in the face of injustice. David, though powerful and wise, failed to protect his family, and the result was a devastating sequence of pain and revenge. Silence can be as damaging as violence itself, as it allows evil to flourish and cause deep wounds that are difficult to heal. Now, let's address some questions that you may have had and how we can take them into our own lives. The first question is, what factors allowed the tragedy to occur in David's family? So, the tragedy in David's family was made possible by several interconnected factors. A complicated family environment. David had several wives and children by different women, which led to rivalry and division. This family structure, common among monarchs of the time, fostered jealousy and ambition, creating an environment prone to conflict. Presence of negative influences. Jonadab, Amnon's friend and cousin, played a key role in fueling Amnon's dark intentions towards Tamar. Instead of advising Amnon to avoid improper thoughts, he encouraged an evil plan, showing how a bad influence can aggravate delicate situations. David's passivity as a leader and father. Even when he learned what had happened to Tamar, David remained silent. He was furious but took no effective action to punish Amnon or protect his daughter. This inaction was devastating because, by not acting, David gave Absalom, Tamar's brother, the opportunity to seek revenge, further aggravating the family situation. How did David's decisions influence the fate of his sons? David's decisions, or lack thereof, profoundly influenced the fate of his sons, with devastating consequences. When David learned of Amnon's attack on Tamar, he became enraged but took no disciplinary action. This silence and inaction showed his sons that justice was lacking within the family, especially when he was the king and had the power to act. The lack of an adequate response left Tamar helpless and encouraged Absalom to seek personal revenge, which led to a spiral of violence. Amnon, as the firstborn, enjoyed privileges, and David did not impose clear limits on his actions. By tolerating certain behaviors and not confronting evil directly, David allowed arrogance and abuse of power to take root in the family. This reinforced in Amnon the idea that he could do whatever he wanted without suffering the consequences. Absalom, after the rape of Tamar, waited for his father, David, to take a fair stance. But when he saw that nothing was done, he harbored resentment and hatred for Amnon and his own father. This lack of closeness and communication between David and Absalom resulted in a series of events that culminated in brutal revenge. David's omission, both as father and king, led Absalom to feel he had to take justice into his own hands, which led to even more violence and destruction in the family. What lessons about family and leadership can be drawn from this story? David, while attentive to the affairs of state, did not pay the same attention to the dangerous dynamics within his own home. This story reveals the importance of parents and leaders being aware of what is happening in their homes and recognizing the warning signs, such as rivalries, negative influences, and family tensions. The absence of such vigilance can leave family members vulnerable to conflict and abuse. David showed inaction by not punishing Amnon after Tamar's abuse. This silence sent the message that injustices could occur without repercussions. As leaders, it is crucial to take firm action in the face of injustice, especially within the family, to protect the most vulnerable and preserve family harmony. Failing to act can be seen as complicity and can lead to serious consequences, such as the cycle of revenge that occurred between David's sons. History shows that Tamar and Absalom didn't feel they could seek justice or protection from David. Tamar suffered in silence, and Absalom, without an open channel of dialogue with his father, opted for revenge. This example highlights the importance of creating a family environment where members feel safe to express their concerns and where there is mutual support. This strengthens trust and helps prevent internal problems from developing into tragedies. What do you think of this impactful story? Have you come across situations where silence has brought irreparable consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories that make us reflect on life. Leave your like and share so that more people can learn these valuable lessons. Comment below. Destructive silence. If you stayed until the end,